At Sal's diner, the smell of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee masks a deeper tension brewing behind the scenes. When David Hernandez, a young Latino waiter, witnesses his coworker Tasha Williams, a black single mother, being unfairly targeted by discriminatory policies, he's faced with a choice: stay silent to protect his paycheck or risk everything to fight for justice. In this gripping story of courage, resilience, and allyship, follow David's journey as he learns the true cost and power of taking a stand. The bell above the door of Sal's diner chimed as David Hernandez pushed it open, the familiar smell of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee greeting him. The diner was already buzzing with activity, the clatter of plates, the chatter of customers, and the steady rhythm of orders being called out from the kitchen. David tied his apron around his waist as he walked behind the counter, nodding to Maria, the head waitress who had been with Sal's for over 2 decades. Maria, in her mid-50s, was the heart of the diner, quick with a smile but equally quick to scold if anyone slacked off. "You're late," Maria said, glancing at the clock. "By 2 minutes," David replied, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "2 minutes is too many," she shot back, but her tone was more teasing than stern. David chuckled as he grabbed his notepad and made his way to his first table. Working at Sal's wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and in this neighborhood, jobs like this were hard to come by. In the kitchen, Tasha Williams, the line cook, was flipping pancakes with practiced ease. A single mother in her early 30s, Tasha was the backbone of the kitchen, her movements efficient and her commentary sharp. "Morning, Tasha," David called as he leaned against the kitchen pass-through. Tasha didn't look up. "If you're here to beg for extra bacon on your break, the answer's still no." David grinned. "One time, and you'll never let me forget it." "Damn right," Tasha replied, a smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. Their banter was one of the few bright spots in David's workday. Tasha had a way of cutting through the nonsense, and her dry humor often helped him get through long shifts. At the end of the counter, Salvatore "Sal" Romano, the diner's owner, was holding court. Sal was a stocky man in his late 50s, with a booming voice and a face that turned red whenever he got worked up, which was often. He prided himself on running a tight ship and wasn't shy about reminding everyone who was in charge. "David," Sal bellowed, waving him over. David approached, trying not to cringe. Sal's loud voice always seemed to draw attention. "You got table 5 yet?" Sal asked, jerking a thumb toward the corner booth where a family was waiting. "On it now," David replied, heading off before Sal could say anything else. Sal wasn't the worst boss David had ever had, but his temper and old-school mindset made him hard to deal with. He wasn't shy about playing favorites, and it was clear to everyone that those favorites rarely included employees like Tasha or Amari, the young black dishwasher who had been working at Sal's for a year. The cracks in the diner's camaraderie started to show during a staff meeting that afternoon. Sal called everyone together during the lunch lull, his face serious. "We're gonna be making some changes around here," Sal announced, his hands on his hips. "Things have been slipping lately, and we need to tighten up." He pulled out a list of new policies: stricter uniform rules, mandatory customer feedback tracking, and a change in how shifts were scheduled. "This isn't negotiable," Sal said, looking around the room. "If you don't like it, well, there's the door." Most of the staff exchanged uneasy glances but stayed quiet. David noticed Tasha stiffen, her lips pressed into a thin line. Amari shifted uncomfortably in the corner, clearly uneasy. Then Sal added, almost as an afterthought, "And I don't want to hear any more excuses about performance. Everyone pulls their weight, no exceptions." You know who I'm talking about." His eyes flicked briefly toward the kitchen staff, and David felt his stomach twist. The room was silent for a beat too long before Maria chimed in, trying to smooth things over. "We'll make it work, Sal," she said with forced cheerfulness. Sal grunted in response and dismissed the meeting, leaving a heavy tension hanging in the air. As the staff dispersed, Tasha caught David's eye. "You heard that, right?" she asked, her voice low but urgent. David nodded, unsure of what to say. "It's always the same story," Tasha muttered, shaking her head. "Policies that just happen to make life harder for people like me." David hesitated. "Maybe it's not." Tasha cut him off with a sharp look. Don't pretend you didn't hear what he meant." She walked away before David could respond, leaving him with a sinking feeling in his chest. He wanted to believe Sal's intentions weren't as bad as they seemed, but deep down, he knew Tasha was right. That evening, as David clocked out and headed home, the day's events replayed in his mind. Sal's comments, Tasha's frustration, it all felt heavier than usual. At home, his younger sister greeted him with a smile, and his mother asked about his shift. He gave them the usual vague response, not wanting to burden them with his thoughts. But as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the nagging sense that something was deeply wrong, and that doing nothing might make him complicit. The sun cast a hazy glow over the diner the next morning as David arrived for his shift. Inside, the usual bustle of breakfast prep filled the air. Tasha was already in the kitchen, her movements brisk but tense. Amari stood by the sink, scrubbing dishes with a focused intensity that suggested he wanted to stay invisible. David made his rounds, taking orders and delivering plates, but his mind kept drifting to the staff meeting from the previous day. Sal's pointed remarks and Tasha's reaction replayed in his head. He tried to push the thoughts aside, but the tension in the diner was impossible to ignore. Around mid-morning, Sal gathered the staff for another impromptu meeting. David noticed Tasha sigh heavily as she removed her apron and joined the group near the counter. "This won't take long," Sal announced, waving a clipboard in the air. "I've been looking at our numbers, and we're making some adjustments to the schedule." David exchanged a wary glance with Maria. Adjustments usually meant someone was losing hours. "Starting next week," Sal continued, "we'll be prioritizing shifts for those who've been performing consistently. If you've been falling behind, you might see your hours cut." As Sal read off the new schedule, David's stomach tightened. Tasha's hours had been significantly reduced. She'd gone from 5 shifts a week to just 3. Meanwhile, employees like Maria and Elliot had retained their full schedules. Tasha's jaw clenched, but she stayed quiet. David saw her glance at Amari, whose hours had also been cut. "Questions?" Sal asked, his tone making it clear he didn't want any. The room was silent. "Good," Sal said, tucking the clipboard under his arm and walking back to his office. When the meeting ended, David found Tasha leaning against the back wall of the kitchen, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. "They cut your hours too?" he asked hesitantly. Tasha let out a bitter laugh. "Of course they did." Sal didn't even bother pretending this wasn't about me. David shifted uncomfortably. "You don't know that for sure. Maybe it's just..." "Just what?" Tasha snapped, her eyes flashing. "Coincidence? Come on, David. You heard him yesterday. You saw how he looked at me and Amari. This isn't new, it's just getting worse." David wanted to argue, to say something that would make her feel better, but the truth was, he couldn't deny what he'd seen. "What are you going to do?" he asked finally. Tasha shrugged. "What can I do? I've got rent to pay and a kid to feed. I can't afford to fight this." Her words hit David like a punch to the gut. He nodded, unsure of what else to say, and watched as Tasha walked away, her frustration evident in every step. Later that day, David overheard Sal talking to Maria in the storage room. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but their raised voices caught his attention as he passed by. "She's been a problem for months," Sal said, his tone clipped. "Always complaining, always questioning things. If she doesn't like how I run this place, she's welcome to leave." "You're talking about Tasha?" Maria asked, her voice lower but tinged with concern. "Who else?" Sal replied, "I'm not running a charity here. She needs to fall in line, or she can find another job." David's fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to burst in and confront Sal, to tell him he was out of line, but he didn't. Instead, he turned and walked away, his heart pounding. That evening, as the diner emptied out, David found himself alone in the kitchen with Amari. "You okay?" David asked, leaning against the counter. Amari shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "It's whatever. Not like I can do anything about it." David hesitated. "But don't you think it's wrong? The way Sal's treating you and Tasha." "Of course it's wrong," Amari said, his voice quiet but firm. "But what am I supposed to do? He's the boss. If I speak up, I'm out of a job." David nodded slowly, his own sense of helplessness mirrored in Amari's words. When David got home that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was failing Tasha and himself. He knew what Sal was doing was wrong, but the thought of risking his job terrified him. His family depended on his income, and finding another job in this economy felt impossible. As he lay in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, Tasha's words echoed in his mind. "What can I do?" David didn't have an answer, but he knew one thing for sure. Staying silent wasn't sitting right with him anymore. The diner's usual hum of activity was laced with an undercurrent of unease the next morning. Tasha's reduced hours had quickly become the talk among the staff, sparking quiet conversations in the corners of the kitchen and whispers in the break room. David noticed that Tasha kept to herself, her sharp wit dulled by frustration. She worked her shortened shifts with efficiency but avoided eye contact with Sal, her silence speaking volumes. Meanwhile, Amari's once easygoing demeanor had shifted to one of nervousness. He moved cautiously through the kitchen, as if afraid of making a mistake that would give Sal an excuse to cut him loose. David's unease grew when Maria approached him during the lunch rush. "Have you talked to Tasha?" she asked, her tone low and cautious. "Yeah," David said. "She's upset." "Who wouldn't be?" Maria sighed. "I've known Sal a long time, David. He can be difficult, but he's not racist." David stared at her, incredulous. "Did you hear what he said during the staff meeting? And the way he's treating Tasha and Amari? If that's not racist, what is it?" Maria's face tightened. "It's not that simple. Sal's under a lot of pressure right now. Business isn't what it used to be, and he's just trying to keep the place afloat. That doesn't excuse how he's treating them," David said firmly. Maria frowned, clearly uncomfortable. "Just be careful. Picking fights with Sal won't end well for anyone." David watched her walk away, frustration bubbling in his chest. Maria's loyalty to Sal was unshakable, but her refusal to acknowledge the problem felt like a betrayal. That afternoon, David found Tasha in the break room, staring at her phone. "Hey," he said, sitting across from her. Tasha glanced up, her expression wary. "What's up?" "I overheard Sal talking about you," David admitted. Tasha raised an eyebrow. "And?" "He said you're a problem and that if you don't fall in line, you can find another job," David said, his voice heavy with guilt. Tasha snorted, shaking her head. "Sounds about right." David leaned forward. "This isn't right, Tasha. What he's doing, it's not okay." "And what are you gonna do about it, David?" Tasha asked, her tone sharper than she intended. "You gonna tell him off? Risk your paycheck? Because I don't see anyone else standing up for me." Her words stung, but David couldn't argue with them. He felt the weight of his silence, the way it compounded the injustice she was facing. "I don't know what to do," he admitted quietly. Tasha sighed, her expression softening. "Neither do I. But I'm tired, David. Tired of fighting battles I know I can't win." As the week went on, the divide among the staff became more apparent. On one side were those who sympathized with Tasha and Amari but were too scared to speak up, David included. On the other were people like Maria, who defended Sal's actions as tough but necessary. Elliot, the young white server who had joined the diner a year ago, seemed conflicted. "It sucks what's happening to Tasha," he said during a quiet moment with David. "But Sal's the boss. What can we really do?" David frowned. "If we all spoke up, maybe he'd have to listen." Elliot hesitated. "Maybe. Or maybe we'd all end up jobless." Their conversation ended there, but David couldn't shake the feeling that silence was no longer an option. The breaking point came on a busy Friday night. The diner was packed, and the kitchen was working overtime to keep up with orders. Sal stormed into the kitchen, his face red. "What's taking so long?" he barked, glaring at Tasha. "We're slammed, Sal," Tasha said evenly. "Well, maybe if you didn't spend so much time talking, you'd be faster," Sal snapped. Tasha froze, her hands tightening around the spatula she was holding. "I'm doing my job, Sal," she said through gritted teeth. "Barely," Sal retorted. "If you don't like how I run my kitchen, you can leave." The room went silent. Amari looked down at the floor, and the rest of the staff exchanged uneasy glances. Tasha set the spatula down carefully and turned to Sal. "You know what? Maybe I will." She untied her apron and walked out of the kitchen, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. David found her outside, leaning against the back wall of the diner and taking deep breaths to calm herself. "Tasha," he began, but she held up a hand. "Don't," she said. "I've had enough for one night." David hesitated, then said, "If you leave, this place is going to fall apart." Tasha laughed bitterly. "Let it. Maybe then Sal will realize how much he relies on the people he treats like crap." She pushed off the wall and started walking away. "Good luck, David. You're gonna need it." As she disappeared into the night, David felt a crushing weight settle on his chest. Sal's words and actions had pushed Tasha to her breaking point, and now it was up to him to decide which side of the line he would stand on. The following day at Sal's diner, the absence of Tasha Williams was glaringly obvious. Orders moved slower, the kitchen lacked its usual rhythm, and the tension among the staff was thicker than the smell of grease in the air. David carried a tray of plates to a table, his mind far from the cheerful small talk customers expected. Every time he glanced at the kitchen pass-through, now manned by Sal himself, he felt a pang of guilt. Tasha was gone, and he had done nothing to stop it. After his shift, David sat in the diner's break room, replaying the events of the previous night in his mind. His guilt was compounded by Sal's casual dismissal of Tasha's departure, as though losing one of his best cooks was inconsequential. "Don't worry," Sal had said earlier that morning, addressing the staff with his usual bluster. "She wasn't a team player anyway. We'll find someone better." David knew better. Tasha wasn't just a team player, she was the team's anchor. Without her, the cracks in the diner's foundation were already widening. At home, David's family was oblivious to his inner turmoil. Over dinner, his younger sister excitedly talked about her upcoming school play, while his mother asked how his shift went. "It was fine," David replied mechanically, pushing food around his plate. His mother gave him a concerned look. "You've been quiet lately. Is something wrong at work?" David hesitated. He wanted to tell her everything, but the thought of worrying her, or worse, losing his job, held him back. "No, it's nothing," he said finally. But as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, David felt a deep sense of unease. By staying silent, he was becoming part of the problem. The next day, David overheard Sal talking to Maria while refilling his coffee mug. "Tasha leaving was the best thing that could have happened," Sal said, his voice low but smug. "She was always stirring up trouble. We don't need people like that around here." David's grip on the coffee pot tightened. He wanted to speak up, to call Sal out, but fear held him back. Instead, he returned to his table, his stomach churning. Later, during a slow moment in the lunch rush, David found himself alone with Amari in the kitchen. "You doing okay?" David asked. Amari shrugged, his shoulders hunched as he scraped plates. "It's not like I didn't see it coming. Sal's been looking for a reason to push her out for months. You think you're next?" Amari glanced at David, his eyes tired. "Does it matter? He'll find a way, same as he did with Tasha." David felt a wave of frustration. "It shouldn't be like this. We should what?" Amari interrupted, his voice rising. "Fight back. Risk our jobs. Not everyone has that luxury, David." David fell silent, Amari's words cutting through his fleeting sense of resolve. The conversation stuck with him throughout his shift. David couldn't shake the feeling that he was failing, not just Tasha and Amari, but himself. He thought about his parents, who had sacrificed so much to build a better life for their family. They had taught him the importance of fairness, of standing up for what was right. But now, when it mattered most, he was frozen by fear. As the day ended, David lingered in the empty diner, staring at the worn leather booths and faded menu boards. This place had been his second home for years, but now it felt like a battleground. He thought about Tasha's parting words, "Let it fall apart." For the first time, David wondered if she was right. Maybe the only way to force change was to let the cracks grow until the entire structure had to be rebuilt. But was he willing to risk everything to make it happen? The next morning, Sal's diner felt like a powder keg waiting to ignite. The staff moved with subdued energy, their conversations reduced to whispers as they navigated the breakfast rush. The absence of Tasha continued to loom, and customers noticed the slower service, some muttering complaints loud enough for the staff to hear. David felt like he was holding his breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. He knew Sal was aware of the growing unease, but the owner's booming voice and dismissive attitude made it clear he wasn't concerned. During a lull between orders, David approached Elliot, the young white server who had joined the diner a year ago. "Got a second?" David asked. Elliot nodded, following him to the break room. David glanced over his shoulder to ensure they were alone before speaking. "You think what's happening here is okay?" Elliot frowned. "What do you mean?" "Tasha getting pushed out. Sal cutting hours for her and Amari. You really think that's just coincidence?" Elliot hesitated, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. "I don't know. I mean, yeah, it sucks, but what can we do? Sal's the boss." David leaned forward, his voice low but urgent. "If we don't do anything, it's just going to keep happening. First Tasha, then Amari, then who knows? He's counting on us staying quiet." Elliot sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I get it. It's messed up. But I can't afford to lose this job, man." "Neither can I," David said. "But if we don't push back, we're just letting him get away with it." Elliot looked conflicted, but before he could respond, the door to the break room swung open, and Maria stepped in. "You two better not be slacking off," she said, her tone sharp. "We're not," David replied quickly, shooting Elliot a look before leaving the room. That afternoon, as David cleared tables, he noticed Sal talking to a customer near the counter. The conversation seemed casual at first, but then Sal's voice rose, drawing David's attention. "I don't know what people expect these days," Sal said, gesturing broadly. "You try to run a business, and suddenly everyone's got a problem. If they don't like it, they can go work somewhere else." David clenched his fists, anger bubbling in his chest. He wanted to confront Sal right then and there, but the weight of his paycheck and his family's needs held him back. Instead, he returned to the kitchen, where he found Amari scrubbing pots. "I'm tired of this," David said, his voice low but firm. "Sal's out there running his mouth like he's untouchable. We need to do something." Amari paused, glancing at him. "What are you thinking?" "We start talking to people," David said. "Elliot, Maria, whoever we can. If enough of us push back, maybe Sal will have to listen." Amari's expression was skeptical. "You really think Maria's going to go against Sal? She's been here longer than any of us." David shrugged. "Maybe not, but we've got to try. If we don't, nothing's going to change." Over the next few days, David began having quiet conversations with his coworkers during breaks and after shifts. He approached Kevin, the dishwasher, who nodded in agreement but expressed doubts. "I'm with you in spirit, man, but I can't afford to lose this job. I've got bills to pay." David also talked to Lynn, a server who sympathized with Tasha and Amari but seemed hesitant to get involved. "I don't want to make waves," she said. "But if enough people stand up, maybe I'll join in." Slowly, David started to build a coalition, though progress was slow and the fear of retaliation loomed over every conversation. One evening, after closing, David met with Amari and Elliot at a nearby park. "I've been talking to people," David said, pacing back and forth. "Some are on board, but most are scared. We need a plan to get more people involved." "What about a petition?" Elliot suggested. "Something we can give to Sal, showing how many of us want things to change." Amari shook his head. "A petition won't scare him. He'll just ignore it or say we're being ungrateful." "So, what then?" David asked. Amari hesitated before speaking. "We hit him where it hurts. If we all walk out, even for one shift, he won't be able to run this place." Elliot's eyes widened. "A walkout? Are you serious? That could get all of us fired." "Maybe," Amari said. But it's the only way he'll take us seriously. David thought about Tasha, about her frustration and her courage. She had risked everything by standing up to Sal, and now it was his turn. "I'm in," David said finally. Amari nodded, and after a moment's hesitation, Elliot sighed. "Fine. But we need to be smart about this." The three of them spent the rest of the evening planning, deciding to quietly spread the word to the rest of the staff. They knew the risks, but they also knew that staying silent wasn't an option anymore. The lines had been drawn, and David was ready to take a stand. The air inside Sal's diner was heavy with tension as David arrived for his shift the next morning. He'd barely slept, his thoughts consumed by the walkout plan and the risks involved. Amari had already begun quietly talking to other staff, gauging who would be willing to join them. David approached Kevin, the dishwasher, during a break. "You know we can't keep letting this slide," David said, keeping his voice low. Kevin sighed, looking around nervously. "I get it, but man, I've got rent, car payments, everything. If this goes sideways, we'll all be in it together," David said firmly. "Sal can't fire all of us. The more people who stand up, the harder it'll be for him to ignore us." Kevin hesitated but finally nodded. "All right. Count me in." By midday, the plan was starting to take shape. David, Amari, and Elliot had spoken to nearly half the staff, and while not everyone was on board, enough were willing to join the walkout to make an impact. The timing was critical. They decided to walk out during Friday's dinner rush, the busiest time of the week. Without cooks, servers, or dishwashers, Sal would be forced to reckon with their demands. That evening, as David cleared a table near the counter, Sal's booming voice cut through the diner. "You're slacking, Hernandez," Sal barked, his tone dripping with disdain. "Pick up the pace." David froze, his fists clenching at his sides. He wanted to fire back, to tell Sal exactly what he thought of him, but he held his tongue. The walkout was only 2 days away, and he couldn't afford to tip their hand. "Sorry, Sal," David said through gritted teeth, forcing himself to keep moving. The hours dragged on, but the quiet determination among the staff fueled David's resolve. Amari gave him a subtle nod as he passed through the kitchen, and Elliot whispered, "We've got this," as they crossed paths near the break room. For the first time in weeks, David felt like they had a chance to change things. Friday arrived with an air of anticipation and unease. The diner was packed by 6 p.m., the dinner rush in full swing. Sal was in his element, barking orders and making a show of his leadership as customers filled every booth. David glanced at the clock. 6:15. It was almost time. He caught Amari's eye in the kitchen, then gave a quick nod to Elliot, who was delivering plates to a table. At 6:20, David untied his apron and set it on the counter. Amari did the same, followed by Elliot, Kevin, and several others. "Where are you going?" Sal demanded, his face reddening as he noticed the exodus. David turned to face him, his voice steady. "We're done being treated like this, Sal. Until you're ready to listen and make changes, we're not working." Sal's jaw dropped, his face a mix of anger and disbelief. "You can't just walk out. You think this place will run without you? Good luck finding another job." David squared his shoulders. "Maybe it won't run without us. That's the point." The staff filed out of the diner, leaving Sal scrambling to keep up with orders. Customers looked on in confusion as the kitchen and dining floor emptied. Outside, the group gathered on the sidewalk, a mix of nervousness and exhilaration in the air. "What now?" Kevin asked, his voice shaky. Now we wait, Amari said. He's got no choice but to listen. Word of the walkout spread quickly. By the following morning, local news outlets were running stories about the protest, with headlines like, "Diner staff walks out over alleged discrimination," and "Small business owner faces backlash amid claims of racism." Sal refused to comment when approached by reporters, but the impact was immediate. Regular customers began calling to cancel reservations, and social media was flooded with support for the staff. On Saturday afternoon, Sal called David. "We need to talk," Sal said, his tone grudging. David agreed to meet, but only if Amari and Elliot could join him. Sal reluctantly agreed, and the meeting was set for that evening. The diner was eerily quiet as David, Amari, and Elliot walked in. Sal sat at a booth, his usual bluster replaced by a tense silence. "All right," Sal said, gesturing for them to sit. "Let's hear it. What do you want?" David took a deep breath. "We want fair treatment for everyone. That means no more targeting people like Tasha and Amari, no more arbitrary schedule cuts, and no more retaliation for speaking up. And we want clear policies," Amari added. "No more making up rules to suit your mood." Sal's expression hardened, but he didn't argue. He seemed to realize he had no choice. "Fine," Sal said finally. "We'll put some new policies in place. But don't think you can run this place without me." "We don't want to," David said, standing. "We just want what's fair." As they left the meeting, David felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't a perfect resolution. Sal's attitude hadn't changed, but the staff had made their point, and the first steps toward fairness were in motion. The diner reopened the day after the walkout, but the atmosphere was far from normal. Sal, with his arms crossed and his jaw set, watched the returning staff with a wary gaze. While most of the workers came back after the tentative agreement, the tension in the air was palpable. David arrived early, tying his apron and mentally preparing for the day ahead. He caught Amari's eye in the kitchen, and they exchanged a subtle nod, a shared acknowledgement of the battle they'd fought and the uneasy truce they now navigated. The first shift back was rocky. Some customers asked pointed questions about the walkout, while others avoided eye contact, clearly uncomfortable with the media attention the diner had received. "Don't let them rattle you," Amari muttered to David as they passed each other in the kitchen. But the tension wasn't just external. Inside the diner, fault lines among the staff had deepened. "I hope you're happy," Maria muttered to David during a lull in orders. David turned to her, confused. "What's that supposed to mean?" Maria sighed, her voice low but sharp. "You and your little protest nearly cost all of us our jobs. You think Sal would have folded if business hadn't taken a hit? You're lucky he didn't fire everyone on the spot." David felt his temper flare but held it back. It wasn't just about Sal, Maria. It was about making sure people like Tasha and Amari get treated fairly. "You know that." Maria shook her head, her expression a mix of frustration and disappointment. "All I know is that this place used to run smoother before everyone started making waves." She walked away, leaving David to stew in his thoughts. Later that evening, Sal called a meeting with the entire staff. "Let's get something straight," Sal said, his voice as gruff as ever. "I agreed to some changes because I had no choice. But if any of you think you're running the show now, you're dead wrong. This is still my diner." David exchanged a glance with Amari, who looked unimpressed. Sal continued, outlining the new policies they had negotiated: clearer scheduling guidelines, fair distribution of hours, and a zero-tolerance policy for retaliation against employees. But his tone made it clear he wasn't happy about any of it. "This isn't over," Sal said, looking directly at David. "We'll see how long these changes last." The next few weeks were an uphill battle. While Sal grudgingly adhered to the new policies, his attitude remained hostile, and he found subtle ways to undermine the agreement. "You call this clean?" he barked at Kevin one afternoon, holding up a plate. "Maybe you're getting too comfortable." Kevin glared at Sal but said nothing, his hands tightening around the dish he was holding. David watched the interaction, anger simmering just below the surface. The walkout had been a victory, but it was clear that Sal wasn't going to make lasting change easy. Meanwhile, David began noticing a shift in his own mindset. The walkout had awakened something in him, a sense of purpose and agency that he hadn't felt before. He started taking more initiative, stepping in to support coworkers when Sal pushed too far and quietly documenting any violations of their agreement. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift, Amari approached him. "You holding up?" Amari asked, leaning against the kitchen counter. David nodded, though he felt the weight of the ongoing fight. "Barely. Feels like Sal's just waiting for us to slip up." Amari smirked. "Let him wait. We're not going anywhere." Despite the challenges, the diner began to stabilize. Customers started returning, lured by the promise of improved service and fair treatment for staff. The media attention gradually faded, and the staff found a new rhythm. But the experience had changed David. The walkout had shown him the power of collective action and the importance of standing up for what was right, even when it came at a personal cost. One evening, as David closed out his shift, he noticed a familiar figure at the counter, Tasha Williams. "Tasha," he called, walking over with a grin. Tasha smiled, though her expression carried a hint of weariness. "Hey, David. Thought I'd stop by and see how you guys are holding up." "It's been a lot," David admitted, leaning against the counter. "But we're getting through it." Tasha nodded. "I heard about the walkout. That took guts." David shrugged. "We couldn't just let Sal keep getting away with it." "You were right about everything." Tasha's smile widened. "Glad to see you found your voice, David. Keep using it." As she left, David felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight wasn't over, but he wasn't the same person who had hesitated to speak up. 2 months after the walkout, the changes at Sal's diner were beginning to take root, though not without resistance. Sal, begrudgingly adhering to the new policies, remained a storm cloud hovering over the diner, his disapproval palpable in every interaction. But for the staff, the small victories were beginning to feel meaningful. David had grown into an unexpected leader. He wasn't just a waiter anymore. He was the person his coworkers turned to when they needed advice or support. The walkout had transformed him, showing him the power of speaking up and taking action. One afternoon, during a relatively quiet shift, Samantha, a regular customer, approached David. "You were part of that protest, weren't you?" she asked, her tone curious but kind. David hesitated. The media attention had mostly died down, but some customers were still wary of the staff's actions. "Yeah, I was," he admitted cautiously. Samantha smiled. "Good for you. What you all did, it mattered. People noticed." David felt a surge of pride. "Thanks. It wasn't easy, but it felt like the right thing to do." "Keep it up," Samantha said, handing him her payment. "The world needs more people willing to take a stand." Her words lingered with David for the rest of the day, a reminder of why they had fought in the first place. Later that week, Sal called David into his office. The small room was cluttered with paperwork and the lingering smell of cigars. Sal leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Sit down," Sal said, gesturing to the chair across from him. David complied, unsure of what to expect. "I've been watching you," Sal began, his tone gruff. "You're stepping up more. Taking charge." David didn't respond, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "Don't think I've forgotten what you did," Sal continued. "That walkout. You put this place, and me, on the line." David met Sal's gaze, his voice steady. "We didn't want to hurt the diner, Sal. We just wanted things to be fair." Sal snorted. "Fair? Life's not fair, kid. You think the world owes you something because you threw a tantrum." David's fists clenched under the table, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I think people deserve to be treated with respect. That's not too much to ask." For a moment, Sal looked as though he might argue, but instead, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. "You're a pain in my ass, you know that?" David allowed himself a small smile. "I've heard." Sal smirked, though it was fleeting. "Keep doing your job. And keep your people in line. We're done here." David left the office feeling a mix of frustration and satisfaction. Sal might not admit it, but the walkout had forced him to change, even if only a little. That evening, David met with Amari and Elliot at their usual cafe. "How's it going in Sal's office?" Elliot asked, grinning. "Same old Sal," David replied, rolling his eyes. "But he knows we're not backing down." Amari nodded. "Good. He needs to keep knowing." The three of them spent the rest of the evening strategizing ways to maintain the progress they had made. For David, the fight wasn't just about the diner anymore. It was about ensuring that no one else had to go through what Tasha and Amari had endured. The true turning point came a week later, when Sal announced he was stepping back from day-to-day management. "I'll still be around," Sal said during a staff meeting, his tone defensive. "But I've hired someone to handle operations. I need to focus on the bigger picture." The news sent ripples through the staff. While Sal's presence wouldn't disappear entirely, his reduced involvement felt like a victory. The new manager, Rachel Torres, was a breath of fresh air. A seasoned restaurant professional with a reputation for fairness, Rachel quickly began building trust with the staff. She held one-on-one meetings to hear their concerns, implemented additional improvements to scheduling and workload distribution, and encouraged open communication. For the first time, David felt like the diner might actually become the kind of place they had all hoped for. One afternoon, Tasha stopped by the diner again. This time, she seemed lighter, her smile more genuine. "Word on the street is you guys finally got Sal to step back," she said, leaning against the counter. "Yeah," David replied, grinning. "Took a lot, but we got there." Tasha nodded approvingly. "Good. He needed a wake-up call." "Thanks for pushing me," David said. "I don't think I'd have done it without you." Tasha smiled. "You did it for yourself, David. And for everyone else. Keep going." As she left, David felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight wasn't over, but they had come a long way, and he wasn't about to stop now. Sal's diner was almost unrecognizable 6 months after the walkout. The energy inside felt lighter, the air buzzing with camaraderie instead of tension. Rachel Torres, the new manager, had proven to be exactly what the diner needed. Her fair policies and open-door approach had brought the staff closer, creating a workplace where everyone felt valued. David looked around during the lunch rush, a small smile playing on his lips. The diner was full of customers, the staff moved like a well-oiled machine, and for the first time in years, he felt proud to work here. Rachel approached him at the pass-through, holding a clipboard. "David, got a minute?" "Sure," he said, setting down a tray of plates. Rachel motioned for him to follow her to the back office. Once inside, she handed him the clipboard. "I've been thinking," she said. "You've stepped up a lot in the past few months. The staff looks to you, you've got good instincts, and you care about this place." David glanced down at the clipboard, his eyes widening as he read the header, "Assistant Manager Application." "You want me to apply for this?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Rachel nodded. "You've earned it. This place needs someone like you in leadership. What do you say?" David hesitated. The idea of taking on more responsibility was daunting, but as he thought about everything he'd been through, the walkout, the fight for change, Tasha's encouragement, he realized he was ready. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady. Rachel smiled. "I had a feeling you'd say that." As David walked back to the dining floor, a sense of pride filled him. The assistant manager position wasn't just a job, it was a symbol of how far he'd come. That evening, David sat with Amari and Elliot at their favorite cafe, the same spot where they'd planned the walkout months earlier. "You're really going to be assistant manager?" Elliot asked, grinning. "Looks like it," David replied, unable to hide his excitement. "Good," Amari said, raising his coffee cup. "Someone's gotta make sure Rachel doesn't forget about us little guys." David laughed, clinking his glass against Amari's. "Don't worry. I've got you." The next day, as David prepared for his shift, he noticed a familiar face walk into the diner. Tasha Williams took a seat at the counter, her presence commanding attention even in the bustling restaurant. David walked over, a wide grin on his face. "Tasha, what brings you back?" "Just wanted to see how things are going," Tasha said, smiling. David leaned against the counter. "It's better. Rachel's made a big difference, and the staff actually feels like a team now." Tasha's smile widened. "Good. I'm glad you didn't let Sal win." "Neither did you," David replied. "We couldn't have done this without you." Tasha shrugged, but her expression softened. "You didn't need me, David. You found your voice. That's all it takes to start a movement." As she left, David watched her go, a sense of gratitude washing over him. Tasha had been the spark, but it was the collective effort of everyone at the diner that had turned things around. That evening, as David walked home under the glow of streetlights, he thought about how far they had all come. The fight for justice at Sal's diner had been grueling and messy, but it had also been transformative. He wasn't the same person who had stayed silent during those early days of Sal's discriminatory policies. He had learned the power of standing up, of speaking out, and of building solidarity with others. David glanced up at the night sky, a faint smile on his lips. The fight for fairness didn't end here. There would always be new challenges, new battles to face. But he was ready for them, stronger and more confident than ever. Inspired by David's journey to fight for fairness and stand up against workplace discrimination? Share this story to spark conversations about equity and inclusion. Let's ensure every voice is heard and every worker is valued. Together, we can make a difference.